Bayard de Volo. First of all, thank you all for coming. We're so pleased to have you all here. Dr. Bayard de Volo is currently a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her work focuses mainly on gender and sexuality and how this intersects with revolution, war, and social movements in Latin America. Dr. Bayard de Volo is best known for two books, Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs, about mothers and gender identity politics during and after the Nicaraguan Revolution, and Women in the Cuban Insurrection, about women rebels who participated in the Cuban Revolution. Dr. Bayard de Volo has undertaken fieldwork in Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, and Nicaragua, and is currently working on a comparative research project on women, war, and peace. Dr. Bayard de Volo is one of the leading scholars currently writing on women and revolution in Latin America, and we are so pleased to have her today. So thank you so much. And yeah, Dr. Bayard de Volo, if you'd like to screen share, I think you should have the capability to do that.
Okay, terrific. Let me get this going. Okay, there you go. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Danny, for giving me that lovely introduction. I should say, because I might forget to say it at the end, right now I'm working on a big project on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm taking this kind of gendered post-colonial approach to bringing Cuba into its own missile crisis. It's oftentimes or just habitually represented as the staging ground for this brush with nuclear holocaust. And so I'm going into that, trying to work through just so many different documents and sources to come up with the kind of the way that Cuba was representing itself to the world, and at least through the leaders experiencing that moment. And so it's very much bringing in gender and race from a post-colonial perspective. But, and I think of it as kind of building upon the work that I've done before, that is what I'm going to be representing to you here. And I was mentioning at the beginning before some people showed up, but I'm going to go out of order chronologically and look at Nicaragua first and then get into the Cuban case, because that's the way I did it. And so it's more like thinking through my own thought process and ways that I've come to think about women and the topic of revolution. And so some of you, the Nicaraguanists here, might recognize that lead figure in this image is Dora Maria Tellez. And I see some people nodding, and I have to tell you, there's another woman with a gun here too. That's Ana Isabel Morales, and she was also a major figure in the Leon insurrection. And Dora Maria Tellez is somebody, just one of the leading figures of the Nicaraguan insurrectionary period, and then into Nicaraguan government. And then part of the MRS, right? And but she has uploaded just this treasure trove of images on Flickr. So if anybody's interested, you can dive into those, and just through looking through her hundreds of photos, kind of come to a new understanding of just the way that, at least in Leon, this war was fought. All right, so I'm going to begin more formally now. Revolution is so many things, and it's intense feelings of rage and love, anger and euphoria, solidarity and hatred, loyalty and betrayal, grief and hope. Also chaos and planning, shooting and fleeing bullets, creating political platforms and arguing and compromising, and messy failures and costly mistakes, deaths, so many deaths, dismemberment, psychological trauma, and sometimes victory. And in those victorious revolutions, the revolutionary story is condensed and streamlined and so tightly packaged to lead the audience towards some particular conclusions. You know, that we fought the good fight, that history will absolve us, the nation is free, It becomes a simplified, dominant, familiar narrative of a Revolutionary War story that is itself a tool of sorts for the revolution and power, that revolutionary state. And so, perhaps less than consciously at first, the way I've approached revolution is to poke around beyond that single story and disrupt the narrative or simply wander off the narrative path. And sometimes to add marginalized or forgotten pieces of the story told by marginalized or forgotten participants. Other times to challenge the revolutionary state and its claims, but going beyond the single story, be it by disruption or following a near forgotten trail or off-road exploration, I think is a key task for the academic in studying revolution. I take an interdisciplinary approach to my work. So I am a political scientist by training. That's my PhD. And my first book was an ethnography, predominantly. It's political ethnography, and addressed primarily the literature and sociology concerned with revolution and social movements, while my most recent book relies primarily on the archives and draws from and builds upon the work of historians as much as any other discipline. But I am a gender scholar through it all, and this informs the questions I ask as well as my approaches. It is also, more than anything else, what gets me off the beaten path of the Revolutionary War stories. For women are usually not part of the formal war stories, and when they are, they're celebrated because they either exemplify gendered ideals, often as mothers, or so clearly and temporarily disrupt those gendered ideals as armed combatants. So tracking what women actually did and experienced gives a much broader, richer understanding, not only of women in the Revolutionary War, but of the war itself and how revolutionary armed conflicts are fought and won. Women, furthermore, are more likely to speak to that devastation of war, including armed insurrection and counter-revolution that leaves when it rolls through towns and villages. The loss, the trauma, physical and emotional, these are vitally important details, even if they are inconvenient to a war story emphasizing the heroic narratives of victory. Move through. Here's some more images that I'll just leave as background while I'm talking this introductory part. There's three ways that I study gender in war. And in war, in that larger category of war, I include government repression and armed insurrection. And so first of all, looking at what women did and said and how they experienced war. And this is a way of adding to research that is overwhelmingly focused upon combatants who are, these pictures that I'm showing you here, notwithstanding, they're very typically and overwhelmingly men, with women being posed in the traditional literature as at most wars victims, or in some wars as inspiration for combatants. And so this brings us perspectives that speak very directly to grief, I found. Sometimes they're their own maternal heroic war narratives where women talk about raising future soldiers and sending them off to battle to fight for their nation. Women speak as being resistors to the military, blocking draft agents. Women talk as going into combat because of a desire to protect the nation's children, and for other reasons. When they talk about what they contributed to war, a lot of times it's this real behind the scenes war efforts, just taking care of a safe house where combatants would go, for example. And a lot of times it's just they work around these projects that fit broadly within the hearts and minds approach to war, which is this battle for ideas, mobilizing the nation's consent for armed insurrection and delegitimizing the dictatorship. And a lot of my work has really convinced me of how important that aspect of the war effort was to these two different wars, Nicaragua and Cuba. Okay, so that's the first way of studying gender in war, is looking at what women did. and said and how they experienced it. The second one is gender as a tactic, is the way I think about it. So it's more of this military or state conscious and strategic use of gender. State effort to mobilize women's support using very gendered narratives, but also, for example, guerrilla efforts to shame and demoralize the state's military through kind of competing forms of masculinity. Also gendered forms of torture, for example. And the third mode is gender as an organizing principle of society. And so the gender binary, masculine, feminine, is a social construction that in turn constructs us. It organizes how we think about and interact with the world. And as such, gender informs even those processes that appear to be gender-free, including Revolutionary War, the ways that they're fought. Within the binary, to quote Joan Scott, a positive definition rests on the negation or repression of something represented as antithetical to it. Thus, any unitary concept, in fact, contains repressed or negated material. It is established in explicit opposition to another term. And so I think, our primary interpretive task in this way, through this mode of studying gender and war, is to identify the repressed and devalued concept against which the positive is understood, to determine the context and the manner in which it operates, and also to be alert to instances in which differences within what might be seen as a unitary concept come to constitute meaningful contrasts. And so along these lines, feminist theorists of war advocate a methodology that makes us both alert to and suspicious of familiar binary divisions of militarization: strength and weakness, toughness, tenderness, protector, protected, action, passivity, independence, dependence, and of course, masculinity, femininity. The first component of each pair draws on an ideal type of masculinity, and these particular qualities vary across time and culture, but they have the effect of reinforcing gender inequality as well. They also reinforce the power of dominant groups more generally, as subordinate classes and racial groups, including at war, are often represented as lacking the idealized masculine qualities. Yet hegemonic masculinity is never secure, but must be forever proven. And as Carol Cohn tells us, gender discourse becomes a quote unquote preemptive deterrent to certain kinds of thought, including this context of militarization. So that is, certain options and outcomes are rejected out of hand or never arise in the first place. And put differently, gendered assumptions normalize certain actions, decisions, and outcomes such that they appear automatic, inevitable, or just absolutely necessary. Oops. My first big project was the Nicaraguan Revolution and Contra-War, and I began field work for that during the last year of the Contra-War in 1989. In it, I primarily worked through the first two of these three approaches to gender and war, examining how women experienced war, particularly as mothers, which was the primary way in which women were represented and appealed to in Nicaragua. At least that's what I found in my research, and how also looking at how the Sandinista state during the Contra-War used gender in its war effort. And after the Nicaragua book came out, I did field work on gender and insurrection in Cuba, Chiapas, and Colombia. But I realized that temperamentally speaking, I, as a scholar, am just not cut out to do this broadly comparative book project that I had planned. It would be a book with a chapter or two on each of those cases, those countries. And so instead, I dove into Cuba. And at first I was researching Cuba from the mid 1970s up through about 1990, 1991, because I wanted to look at Cuba's war in Angola and also its massive military buildup that it called the La Guerra de Todo el Pueblo, or the War of All the People. And I've actually done a couple articles on that, and I can speak to that later, but what I ended up writing my book on is the insurrectionary period, because through all my research, for that other time period, I came across all these rich testimonials and interviews and stories particularly in Cuban media and elsewhere, that spoke to things that women did and said during the Cuban insurrection that I had never seen written down anywhere. And so I wanted to just capture that and start in the 1950s so that then I could build upon that with my next projects. Yeah, so looking more specifically at Nicaragua, my field work was from 1989 to 1990. I did political ethnography, so over a year of participant observation, particularly with this one women's organization that was called the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs. And I looked at them, I worked with them at a national level, but most particularly, I was working with the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs of Matagalpa, a city in the more northern areas that was closer to where much of the Contra War was being fought. I did over 100 interviews as part of that process as well. And I did a lot of archival research. That was really a core part of my Nicaragua project too, working through media reports. And in Nicaragua, there was two competing newspapers, or there's three actually, two Sandinista newspapers, one that was the official Sandinista newspaper, but then also what came to be a very anti-Sandinista newspaper. And so I was really able to trace these different kind of competing ways that women were being represented and appealed to by these two competing sides in the midst of a growing Contra War. I also did work I got organizational files from the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs, and worked with Spanish, other political materials, and I did a series of FOIA requests, or Freedom of Information Act requests, where I got US State Department, usually it was US State Department documents that also I worked with. So looking at the Nicaraguan piece, in my book, I altered between a macro level approach and a micro level approach. And at the macro level, I was focused upon this revolutionary state and thinking about how it went about mobilizing support for its growing, for first the revolution itself, before the Contra War heated up, but then over time, particularly how it mobilized support for this increasingly unpopular war effort against the counter-revolution. And looking at how that form of trying to legitimize itself and appeal to the public for support and legitimacy changed over time in gendered ways, and increasingly focused upon maternal groups, maternal organizing, and maternal grief. At the micro level, and I looked at specifically this Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs in the case of the Mothers of Matagalpa, and working to understand, what was their understanding of revolution, and how did that understanding impact the work that they were doing in this women's organization? Why did they join? What kept them coming back day after day, year after year, such that they continued to be mobilized even after the Contra War ended and the Sandinistas were voted out of power? So I'm going to only present on parts of the time period to simplify matters, that these are some of the more dynamic parts of it. The revolutionary state that was increasingly at war, initially, even from the beginning, there were some counter-revolutionary attacks. And so the Sandinistas, the newly formed revolutionary government in the post-Somoza era, had to deal with these attacks. And it initially had a volunteer military in which women were allowed to serve. And the way it represented women predominantly and appealed to them was through this conflation of women as both mothers and combatants. So they were combatant mothers. In this case, the ideal mother armed herself in defense of not only her own child, but the nation's children. And so this image is a very well-known image that really shows how these two ways of being that are usually juxtaposed were brought together. So we have a woman with a rifle over her back and a baby at her breast. And Tomas Borge, who was a poet, but also a Sandinista leader, kind of encapsulated this representation. And he wrote, bourgeoisies and traders, here are our women, standing up in tenderness and heroism, with their hands caressing the delicate skin of their children, with their eyes open and watching, with their fingers on the triggers of their guns, and on their lips the war cry. So this is the predominant representation from about 1979 up through 1983, when it was a voluntary militia. But once the Contra War heated up to a certain point, that the Sandinista state decided to implement a draft, the way that women were represented and appealed to changed pretty clearly. It was within that year shifted over towards trying to manage women's resistance, manage their complaints. And there were many, many maternal complaints, particularly in the anti-Sandinista press. It's called Nuevo Diario. You would see many women writing letters to the editor or being interviewed and saying they were complaining about the Sandinista ideology that was being imposed upon their son. But more in a more emotionally evocative way, they would talk about the harsh conscription methods that their sons were being subject to. And so what you found were stories of buses being stopped as they were traveling from one city to another. And any young man who looked to be of draft age would be forcibly taken off that bus and put into the military. And so women were complaining about that mode of draft, of implementing the draft, but also writing that their sons weren't even of age, though they had difficulty proving it because so many people didn't have birth certificates. They also complained about the harsh training methods of the military and the terrible lack of communication, where you can just see, even though these young men were being stationed within Nicaragua, they weren't hearing from their sons. Communications weren't going back and forth such that their parents, particularly their mothers, knew anything about whether they were still alive, much less where they were stationed. And so I kind of framed this mode of representing women as omnipotent supplicants, because that was a quote used at one point by the increasingly anti-Sandinista press, was that, listen to these mothers, they're complaining, their complaints are valid. There's also stories about mother-led anti-draft protests, and these kind of stories also kind of found their way into U.S. reports as well, even like in the New York Times and whatnot, where women, when they would hear that the draft, I guess we could call them draft officers, were coming to town, they would, just like the rebels had done just a couple of years prior, they would pull up the cobblestones of the street, create barricades, and prevent these draft officers from coming in and drafting their sons. And I got the details through the FOIA request that I had mentioned, but there was the US, as part of its multi-pronged efforts against the Sandinista government, was funding and advising the mothers groups, anti-Sandinista mothers groups, and publishing their materials as well. So I call this kind of a redrafting of motherhood. So where the focus turns away from women as combatants and mothers, focuses in turn upon mothers of combatants, particularly with a focus upon draftees. And so one of these manifestations of that new effort was what I call patriotic wombs. And the sentiment is encapsulated by Gioconda Belli, who was a Sandinista rebel and also poet. And this is part of a poem that she wrote that was called "We Will Bear Children." We will bear children for every man or woman whom they kill. We will give birth to hundreds of children who will continue in their footsteps. Spartan mothers is another manifestation, or kind of an ideal type, that mothers were enjoying to try to emulate. And this image is of mothers of heroes and martyrs in Esteli, and they have this, I think the museum I've told still exists, but they have this wonderful collection of you know, different artifacts from that war effort, particularly the insurrection. And but the concept of the Spartan mothers is the mothers of Sparta were said to send their sons off to war and tell them to not come back home unless victorious or carried on their shield, in other words, dead. And so I never really saw a mother speaking to that extent. But there was multiple expressions, such as the quote that I'm showing here. A mother who lost one son said, "I am ready to give all of my children and die with them rather than be under the boot of imperialism." And so this was another ideal type that women were enjoying to emulate. The mothers of heroes and martyrs themselves were key to this part of the war effort, and they were called upon to do a variety of tasks for the war. And one of them that the mothers that I was interviewing, that they kept coming back to repeatedly, was that they were called upon to deliver the news of a combatant's death to his mother. And a lot of times they had to travel, like the military would show up in the middle of the night with bodies in the back of a truck in some kind of makeshift coffins, and the mothers would be collected from their homes and driven sometimes hours away and they were tasked with delivering the news to the mother, knocking on her door and telling her this, and then to comfort her. And that was a task that was really important to these women, because they would say that that's how they would want to have been told themselves, is through another mother who knew their pain. But the mothers in this task were also expected in so many ways, explicitly expected to do some propaganda work with those newly grieving mothers and turn their grief away from the Sandinistas state and towards particularly the U.S. and also the Contras. It's not the Sandinistas' fault that the Contras are in the hills fighting. It's the U.S. that has armed them. So that was emotionally important for the mothers of heroes and martyrs to do that, and also really emotionally difficult. They also were expected and encouraged to speak publicly to journalists and visiting delegations from North America and whatnot, and to people like me, to talk about the war effort and about their fallen children. And also, particularly directing themselves towards Nicaragua, expressed an obligation that Nicaraguans had to the fallen, such that their blood is not shed in vain. We need to, redouble our efforts against the Contras. And also to support mothers of combatants who were living combatants and the mothers of those combatants. And this took on kind of this universal motherhood, where these mothers of fallen Sandinistas then became kind of unofficial mothers to, say, combatants who were recuperating in a nearby hospital or were based at a nearby military base, whose own mothers couldn't visit them. So they did a lot of that kind of work as well. And this is all, me learning about the mothers of heroes and martyrs, but also learning about this really core way that the Sandinista state was trying to manage a war effort and engender and maintain support for that war effort and for its own government in the context of an increasingly unpopular draft effort. Why mothers? There was this real cultural resonance that mothers had in Nicaragua, as well as much of Latin America, but also there's this international component too, in that they really seem to resonate not only with a domestic audience, but an international audience in terms of expressing the cost of the Contra War, US funded Contra War within Nicaragua. Um, there's also a very high percentage of female headed households in Nicaragua. And so many of the women that I was working with in the Heroes and Martyrs were single mothers and without financial support, but from the fathers of their children. And now with that, oftentimes it'd be their oldest or one of their oldest sons who had died. And so they were particularly destitute. And many of the women I was working with also were internal refugees from the war. So they were just recently arriving in the city of Matagalpa from the countryside. Also, women were excluded from the draft. And so this was a way of contributing to the war effort in an alternative fashion. And there was also these very powerful anti-Sandinista conservative groups that these mothers were an answer to. The anti-Sandinista groups were very often affiliated with a very conservative Catholic Church hierarchy. And so it was, these idealized mothers were an effective contrast to those types of anti-Sandinista organizing. I'm going to just speak very briefly to some of these aspects in the sense of neoliberalism and the way that violence continues long after the initial war is over. But I'm going to skip through it. This is a great quote that a woman said to me that kind of really brought me to this different way of thinking about neoliberalism, because she said, like, yes, the Contra War is over. Before it was a war of bullets, but now with neoliberalism, it is a war of the stomach. There's the lingering post-war emotional trauma that isn't, really, I can't access this in the context of Cuba. It's very difficult to find signs and evidence of people talking about this. But in Nicaragua, this is what I was just confronted with almost on a daily basis in my field work, is just that lingering post-war, the lingering emotional trauma in the post-war context, in which people really didn't see themselves as being over the war. This is an image of a sign that's saying danger. There's mines. This is along the border with Honduras, and there were mines along this family's path that they walked to their pasture with every day. And just guns were all over Nicaragua in the post-Contra War era. And nightly I'd be woken up by, guns going off, or sometimes twice grenades exploding on the block. But let me shift over to the Cuban insurrection, doing so out of order, admittedly. And in my more recent book, The Women in the Cuban Insurrection, I set about re-examining the Cuban insurrection with a gender lens in those three distinct but related ways that I had mentioned already. I started with the simpler question of what women did in the insurrection. How did women participate? This is today often understood as an incomplete approach. Adding women to a historical event often does not significantly alter our understanding of it. So while such work is important and it's hard work to do, I also take two gendered approaches, which also upend our understanding to a certain extent of the Cuban Revolution. First, I examine gender as a tactic, or the tactical conscious use of gender as a means of gaining an advantage in war. And second, I examine how gender is a key way in which power itself is articulated, along with race and sexuality in other fields. So first, what did women do? How did they contribute to the insurrection? And here, the cover image of my book is a poor representation of my work and what I was aiming for, but I couldn't talk my editor out of it. The reason I say it's a poor representation is because I work to go beyond the most familiar details of the big heroines and heroes around which most rebel stories concerning women revolve. So here you see an image of, it's this photojournalist named Enrique Meneses, and it's his image of two of the most famous women rebels, Celia Sanchez and Vilma Espín. And this is the image, though, that I wanted to use, and it just wasn't clear enough for us. There's some fuzziness, and it seemed too obscure of a reference. But this is an inspirational image for me. So this image is the image by the same photojournalist, Enrique Meneses, that I wanted for my cover. It portrays Fidel Castro reclining in the guerrilla camp at night, reading by candlelight with the caption, Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra. And he's framed, he is the subject of this photo. But what caught my eye and my imagination is the woman to his right who sits beside him, head bowed, physically holding up a candle for Fidel to read by. So, who is she? And Meneses does not tell us. In all likelihood, she was a bit actor who played a minor role in the insurrection, but without her and so many more like her, Fidel never would have succeeded. So my work is in part a people's history of the Cuban insurrection, or, I was kind of moving to the extent that I could in that direction, with a focus principally, but not exclusively, on women whose history of activism has been acknowledged, but remained largely unexplored. Though I want to give a shout out to historian Michelle Chase, who is a key exception here. Given the spotlight trained upon Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, and to a lesser extent other rebel leaders, often bearded and always in their olive green fatigues, a focus that includes rank and file women forces one off the literature's center stage to inquire about those who held the candle for Fidel to read by, who smuggled the messages down from the mountain, who kept the safe houses clean and stocked with food, who joined outlawed funeral processions, or hid rebels in their own homes. These are decidedly not the bearded rebels romanticized or vilified in the literature. This is one of my chapters, but I want to skip over this story about women in U.S. diplomacy, just for lack of time. But it's just to briefly explain it. These are Cuban women who, when the new U.S. ambassador, Earl Smith, was visiting Santiago on the other side of the island from Cuba, they organized and they kind of dressed in their Sunday best. And kind of when he got out of his car, they ran up to him and protested. And he ended up he was emotionally moved by what they were telling him, and he put out a statement that actually got him criticized and in trouble. But it speaks to ways that these women actually had an impact on U.S. diplomacy in that era that hasn't quite been appreciated to the extent that it should be. There's also a story I could tell about the Moncada trial and the way that, so this is shown as kind of this brutal aftermath of the attack on the Moncada barracks that Fidel led, and which led to his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech in the courtroom in his own defense. And you see Fidel Castro there upon his arrest after the Moncada attack. And it was a terrible military defeat for the rebels. But it's so fascinating how you just can't concentrate on that military defeat, because really it was a propaganda victory, or in the War of Hearts and Minds, it's what put this rebel group on the map. And the way that courtroom defense was delivered had some very important gendered components to it. I want to actually go into more detail on the guerrilla gender tactics, just to give you an idea there. In 1957-58, in Cuba, as the armed insurrection was increasingly revolving, it had shifted. There were still urban struggles going on, but it was increasingly shifting over towards the Sierra Maestra and the guerrilla warfare in the countryside. And in this context, these rebels pursued several gendered tactics in their struggle for hearts and minds that accompanied their less frequent military engagements. So military morale is often recognized as important, but portrayed as something that's not really to be managed or targeted. Rather, it is thought to rise and fall with battlefield victories and independent factors such as the weather or lack of supply. So what I'm saying is, like, militaries talk about morale, but we don't tend to, there's not enough studies about how militaries actually try to engage with and affect morale through these more hearts and minds efforts that I'm going to discuss. But evidence in this Cuban case points to very active strategizing on the part of the rebels to target the Batista military's morale, and these tactics were often gendered. So in late 1958, Fidel explained that, and I'm quoting, his secret weapon lay in his enemies' minds. They did not want to risk themselves for what they presumably were sworn to defend. Compounding this, the rebels' carefully cultivated reputation for treating prisoners humanely led the Batista military soldiers to conclude that it was preferable to surrender than to risk their lives fighting back. As Castro summarized during the insurrection, rebel victory depends not so much on arms as it does on morale. Once we capture the heart of the soldier, he will find it hard to fight. And I just want to stress this because on the one hand, this is what he was saying at the time or soon after, but it's not the way that the Cuban War story unfolded. And it's not the story that we tend to hear today about how this war was fought and won. And so I'm trying to kind of bring back in all this language and these extensive efforts towards capturing hearts and minds, in this sense through attacking the opposing military forces' morale. The guerrillas pursued a 2-year gendered offensive that, in redefining masculine honor, targeted government soldiers' will to fight, attracted them to the rebel cause, and promised humane treatment upon surrender. In return, the rebels gained new recruits among defecting soldiers, along with their weapons, which was super important, and were increasingly effective in combat. Specifically, the rebels represented themselves as a brave and invincible force, undermining the traditional measures that cast Batistas as the superior army and inverting hierarchies within masculinity. So though they were bedraggled and rough in appearance and small in number and very poorly armed, the rebels were increasingly successful at posing themselves as the real men, measured by honor, courage, and sacrifice. Rebels furthermore exploited tensions within Batista's military by distinguishing between honorable and debased masculinity. The rebels positioned themselves as honorable men, hailing like-minded soldiers, pulling them towards the insurrection. They used Radio Rebelde to disabuse regime soldiers of the idea that they must either win or die trying. So, what the dictatorship would like is not for us, this is one of the messages delivered over the radio, not what the dictatorship would like is not for us to cure the wounded soldier and respect the lives of our prisoners, but for us to murder them without exception so that every member of the armed forces would feel bound to fight and give his very last drop of blood. But from Castro's tactical perspective, the perception of showing compassion towards one's enemies, once captured, could be more effective than aggression. And furthermore, in his rendering, the masculine attributes of honor, strength, and courage were also confirmed in not killing one's enemies. In contrast, Batista's forces, by killing innocents and rebels after capture, proved themselves to be substandard men, even subhuman animals, or sometimes they were called just monsters. So you see clear echoes from the narrative originally pursued in the Moncada trial, also extrapolated to the Sierra Maestra. Rebel propaganda, however, did not treat Batista's military monolithically. It took advantage of the fractures within the military and exacerbated them, distinguishing most soldiers as men of honor and Batistianos as the contrast. They were the thugs, rapists, and assassins. And Castro invited those honorable soldiers and thousands of soldiers, honorable officers and thousands of soldiers who do not want to be traitors to their people, to fight alongside the rebels. And thus the rebels included as latent allies most of the men with whom they engaged in combat. The real enemies for rebels and honorable soldiers alike then were Batista and his henchmen. For example, Castro issued a message on July 3rd, 1958, condemning Batista's reluctance, in this case, to receive wounded soldiers from his own forces handed over by the rebels. He said, "These are wounded soldiers from his own army, and only a traitor and a man with no feeling towards the men who serve him would refuse the Red Cross permission to give them the care they need." Such portrayals of rebel humanity were consistently posed against Batista's inhumanity in a very masculine sense and his refusal or inability to protect his own men. There's a final instance that I can go into here, and I call it the even the women approach. And these are Las Marianas, or the small group of women who were armed in the amongst the rebels in the Sierra Maestra. They were called Las Marianas, or the Mariana Grajales Women's Platoon. But actually, I mean, you can ask questions about it, but let me just stop there, and I can stop sharing my slide too, because I want to make sure I don't go too much over time and have time to take questions and turn this in towards what other people would be more likely to want to learn about. There, for a minute, my arrow had disappeared. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I loved hearing about all those interesting examples from Nicaragua and Cuba. So yeah, I guess we can open it up for questions. I have a couple of questions from the RSVP list, but we can get to that in a bit. First, let's just like open it up. If you want to use the hand raising feature under the participants tab, I think that would probably be the best way to do it, or you can put your question in the chat if you'd like. So yeah, if anyone has a question, please feel free. Marlon, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Bayard de Volo. I thought this was really fascinating, and it gave me a lot to think about, because one of the projects I'm working on for one of my seminars this semester is sort of trying to look at women's experiences in the revolution in Colombia at the turn of the 20th century in the Thousand Days War. And you mentioned like one of the things that you tried to do in the project is look at what women did and said and how they said it. And so I'm curious, like, what kind of advice you would have for when you can find out what women did, but not necessarily what they said, in the sense that, a lot of the source bases might come from male voices. And so women appear, but it's not women writing about what they did, or, them saying it. They're there, but it's through a distinctly male perspective.
Yeah, that is such a good question, because I think it's something we do confront across a variety of these cases. And so one thing I want to say about that is just the importance of kind of maintaining a distance from these narratives, right? In that, at least in the sense of thinking about how they're being framed, and trying to work, if you have enough of them, you can kind of work through what kind of broader message seem to be conveyed through the trends that you're seeing and how women are represented in this fashion. And so I'm not sure, Marlon, could you tell me, like, who tends to speak for these women or describe what they did? Are they more academic historians, or are they kind of they're partisans, or fellow combatants? Or
Sure. So, I mean, most of the places that I see them get mentioned are in memoirs written by the male participants, and these tend to be generals or, higher ranking officers writing about their experiences. And, they'll mention women in various capacity, both military or non-military. So it's really fascinating for me, because it's clear that women's presence is such that even generals writing their memoirs have to talk about them in some way, but then also it's they're sort of relegated to brief snippets or anecdotal mentions.
Yeah, well, so you're really onto something, right? Because just they are there enough that they bear mentioning, and even if they've kind of fallen out of the war story as it's been passed along and kind of cultivated. And so in that sense, it seems like an interesting intervention that you can make in the war story, and looking for trends in terms of these ideas of what they did. Like what? So the way one of the ways I would approach it is to look for ways that women were, their acts or their comportment or their character was idealized, you know. And then, I mean, because I think so often in these kind of contexts, there's a reflection upon gender, but there's also a construction of gender, you know, in terms of what the ideal woman does, and valorizing specific women for behaving in an idealized fashion. So there was, in the Cuban Wars for Independence, there was a lot of this kind of work that was done, and sometimes certainly in, like, Jose Marti reflects upon Mariana Grajales, who is one of the original, or at least Cuba's original Spartan mother, where she gave birth to sons who ultimately became Cuban heroes of the independence war efforts. And when one was fallen, she famously turned to her youngest son and said, "You, it's your turn." And you know, did she literally say that? Like, I tend not to kind of grapple in that kind of context. I wouldn't grapple with, like, did she really say that, so much as what kind of work is being done by repeating these stories. And what in turn does that tell us about how this military understood itself in the way it was pursuing that war effort? Because it is, I mean, it's kind of ironic for me to say this, but the US military itself is becoming much more conscious and interested in this so-called hearts and minds effort. You know, they recognizing that you can't just do shock and awe. You can't just fight your way in and out of a war. You need to deal with ideas, and you need to kind of, to put it one way, manufacture consent or establish legitimacy. And I think that just because it took the US military so often to have this certain consciousness of it, doesn't mean that prior militaries weren't very aware of that. And you can kind of trace these efforts. But thank you, that was a great question. Good luck with that project too, that's great.
Thank you.
We have a question from Dr. Babb.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to wait and see if others might be also raising hands, but I loved listening to your talk, Lorraine, and it was so good to hear you talking about both Nicaragua and Cuba, and it, you know, it stirs up lots of interesting ideas and questions. I'm just thinking about knowing a bit more about the Nicaraguan case than the Cuban one, but having spent some time in both places myself. I guess you began in Nicaragua in '89, as I did, but you were looking principally back at the experience of women in the revolutionary period, or the revolution and toward the triumph. And my work as an anthropologist was sort of starting in '89 and returning in the early '90s to look at that decade, the neoliberal decade, and the post-revolutionary, you know, post-1990 elections. And so I can't help but think about, you know, what happened after some of the times that you're describing, both in Nicaragua and Cuba, and maybe it's not quite fair. So that's why I wanted to defer to anybody who's a little more head on with you know, what you're addressing. But I know you must have lots of thoughts about what transpired after as well. And so I'm just thinking about, you know, the mobilization of women by the state and by the parties, you know, at least by the FSLN, as mothers, the motherist movements and so forth, and, you know, utilizing women to the purpose of serving the revolution. And you could say, I think, that in Nicaragua anyway, it was only after the revolution in the early '90s that some women split away as autonomous feminists, and, you know, organized feminist groups and movements that had their own identities that were distinctly different from what had gone before. And then there was the kind of coexistence of motherist movements, because the mothers of heroes and martyrs still was there, right? I met some of them in the early '90s, and but very different politics, and different politics from AMLAI, the Sandinista women's mass movement. So I just wonder, you know, if you could say a little bit about that, about, you know, if it could only be after the triumph of these revolutions that women could express that sort of feminist identity. And I don't know whether you'd say that there was anything comparable for Cuba, happening in Cuba. You know, I am aware of people active around gender and sexuality in Cuba in more recent times, but I don't know whether you would see parallels with Nicaragua in that regard or not so much.
Yeah, well, thank you and for that opportunity, because while I was studying the mothers, the heroes and martyrs, I was living in Nicaragua, interacting with feminists and you know, in a number of the groups I interacted with, sometimes they weren't necessarily kind of adopting this identity as feminists, but they were working towards other goals. And so, yeah, I really watched with great interest these splits within the Sandinista Party, the splits of many prominent, important feminists from the Sandinista Party as well. And I'm trying to kind of figure out like what route I want to go on, but I guess I should go with more some of my clearer strengths, you know, in terms of what I had more unique exposure to, because I think some like your own work has been so good in covering some of this, so much of this groundwork, and as well as others like Karen Campworth has focused on it as well, and others. But one thing I visited and interviewed and did participant observation with with a series of women's reproductive clinics that were just popping up almost overnight, it seemed to me. You know, like the Contra War ended, the Sandinistas were voted out of office, the US economic embargo was lifted, and then like even in the smaller cities, you started to see women's reproductive clinics. And so I would go and interview them, and oftentimes I would be just the only person there. It would be me and like 3 or 4 people working there and no clients. So it was like this, and with my interviews, I took the same approach of asking these feminist women who are running who are Nicaraguan women running these reproductive clinics, as I took with the mothers, the heroes and martyrs, and I would ask them like, well, what got you interested in this line of work? And you know, what keeps you active in it over the years? And they would just look at me and say, you know, Lorraine, like, this is where the money is. This is what's getting funded externally. And they did, this is not to say that they didn't care about women's reproductive issues, but it's to say that these were college educated, just brilliant women who used to be in various capacities supported by a Sandinista state that no longer existed. And in a time of neoliberalism, you needed to look for other forms of funding. And so they were pretty unique in being able to kind of pursue a certain feminist line of work through this external funding. They'd say the hot ones were women's reproductive clinics through international NGO funding, and also environmental issues. Mm-hmm. So that's where you worked. Yeah. But that's kind of a small, like, that's just kind of a small niche of something that I observed. And it was it was another way of me thinking about the US neoliberalism coupled with the US as a superpower, and just the way it's able to throw its weight around, including in terms of incredibly well-minded people, you know, who care about women's reproductive health, but that were kind of driving the way that, you know, who could work where, basically.
Yeah, and just to say, I think that's interesting, and I remember too the early '90s and the groups that you're talking about. I think East Gen and Si Mujer, and yes, including in Matagalpa as well as Managua, and also I think a lot of money was going towards certain kinds of NGOs that were not only around sort of the body politics, reproductive politics, or reproductive health, I should say, for the funding, but also around AIDS, around HIV/AIDS, yes, during that time, so that it was also the beginning of the more autonomous, you know, LGBTQ movement. I would say back then, I was watching that as I went back every year in the early '90s. It was very, very prominent. So
yes, no, yeah, that's a good point. You know, in Esteli, I was in Esteli every weekend. Though I was based in Matagalpa, but I was always in Esteli every weekend, a town a couple hours away. And so one of my friends, I was doing volunteer work with the Unemployed Women's Organization there. That was Sandinista, but on like loosely aligned or with the Sandinistas, and Esteli was still had prominent Sandinistas there. But one of my friends who worked through the Unemployed Women's Organization finally got a job as distributing condoms, and I got my free, use condoms t-shirt from Nicaragua that I still have somewhere. So yeah, I can attest to that as a major and very positive way of funding. But at the same time, just thinking through the way I had been thinking about people's activism was, I think, a little naive, in the sense like I had formerly been looking at people who were in the midst of war, grieving, and kind of mobilizing in order to address that grief, support the Sandinista effort. And also there's a material aspect to their interest too, and that they sometimes had select access to material goods. And these were very, poor women, a lot of times internal refugees. But so they kind of didn't have any choice, there was a lack of choices that they were situated within that also kind of explains why they would mobilize into something like the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs. And I kind of, in a different way, learned a similar lack of choices when I was questioning people like in the Unemployed Women's Organization and the women's reproductive clinics. It's just needing to find a way to get food in your mouth day to day and still be an activist and stay true to your principles is really a luxury.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that period of NGOization and
Yes.
all of that was very, very strong then. So
yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, there's other kind of observations I could make, but more on an anecdotal level in terms of feminist organizing. And there was a feminist group that worked with the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs. It was an overtly feminist group. It was really super supportive, and the level of emotional accompaniment with the Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs in Matagalpa too.
So we have a submitted question, and it asks, how has the role of revolutionary or activist women changed over time into the modern era in both Cuba and Nicaragua? Have you noticed that, there has been a significant change in their roles since, your period of study?
Well, that's a very super important question, and it's super difficult to answer. In the Nicaraguan context, because I was there, my fieldwork was over a decade from 89 to 99, and so I saw, and this is in part what Dr. Babb was referring to. Is there's this real blossoming of feminism and in an autonomous form, and that was very exciting to see, even though it was fraught with some really kind of tough conflicts that revolved around what the Sandinista party itself was or was not doing. But I had my fieldwork doesn't extend beyond 1999, and so I should limit my observations to that era. And in terms of Cuba, I think, and this is one thing I've been talking about with some students here, is this notion of the way that Cuba represents itself and its revolution to the world oftentimes revolves around women and women's accomplishments, particularly as those can be quantified. So, you can say this percentage of the National Assembly is our women, and that's like super easy. And Cuba's at the top, or it's second highest percentage, and it's fairly, when you only have a single party, and so all the competition is happening within the party. It's not as difficult as it would otherwise be for that to be ensured to have happen. Is it whatever, 50% of the National Assembly is women. A lot of this way of Cuba representing itself has for a long time revolved around maternal and infant mortality rates and other health measures that are attached to its medical field and its medical accomplishments. And more recently, this has taken on some kind of gendered and sexualized components to it too. And so Mariela Castro, you probably have heard, has been very prominent over the last, I don't remember when she really came into being, but she, as a political figure, but she runs what's called CENASEX, which is the Center for Sex Education in Cuba. She's also, very importantly, was Fidel Castro's niece and Raul Castro's daughter, and Vilma Espin, the head of the Cuban Women's Federation's daughter. And so she really has this kind of important pedigree, and she's leading the way in terms of a certain version of sexual freedom and gender identity. And so that there's been a number of sex reassignment surgeries conducted in Cuba that are well known, and it's a very effective way for Cuba to represent itself as modernizing, and progressive, and embracing a certain understanding of freedom, right? But at the same time, Cuba still has not. They don't even allow civil unions, same-sex civil unions, much less marriage, right? And so there's this couple named Wendy and Ignacio, and Wendy is a trans woman who received a sex reassignment surgery, free of charge, as the government paid for it, and my understanding is it's through CENASEX, and she used to work for CENASEX, Maria Castro's the center that she runs. But Wendy has since really parted ways with CENASEX and is now very critical of it. And so they got married. Wendy and Ignacio got married, and they're able to get married because Wendy legally changed her sex to woman or female. And so it became a legal marriage, but they advertised themselves as the first gay wedding of Cuba, and so they kind of retain that language as a very conscious political move to kind of within Cuba. They're a relatively rare moment of critiquing the state. There was also, was it last year or the year before? It must have been the year before the pandemic. There was a gay pride parade that never happened, but then happened. So you're not in Cuba, you're just not allowed to mobilize without the state's permission. And so if you're going to march down the street and have a gay pride parade, it will, and it did get broken up because the state didn't give it permission to happen in Havana. And actually, I have some perspective on this too, because I do some work as an expert witness for asylum cases. I've done a couple in Cuba. And so one of the activists who got roughed up, who really rather badly physically mistreated by the police in breaking up that pride parade, applied for and successfully applied for asylum. She had also been subjected by, her father was high up in the Cuban political hierarchy, and she's a lesbian, and he resisted this, particularly because of how it reflected upon his own career and his own ability to succeed and move up the hierarchy, to continue to move up the hierarchy. And so he was able to arrange to have her forcibly go through conversion therapy in Cuba. So so Cuba is really on the fence. There's a growing, it's certainly in the last, over a decade, opened up to religion in a way that never had before. And it's really open towards including some evangelical tourism down into Cuba. And I actually know people, like, just anecdotally from around my town, that they're like, oh yes, we went down with our church to Cuba and met and ministered to people. So this is people are on the US side, people are allowed to travel to Cuba for religious reasons. So on the US side, it's all okayed. And then Cuba also seems to allow them to do it in part. I don't know why, but part of it is they bring in pretty significant tourism dollars. But and I can't myself make a link between these things happening and the growing evangelical movement, but it's in Cuba, but it makes sense to me that these are not coincidental. The evangelical groups are growing in Cuba, and they're the ones that are mobilizing, or perhaps being used by the state to speak out against same-sex marriage. So maybe it's a kind of a relationship of convenience for the Cuban state, but it's really kind of got one foot in the kind of this progressive LGBTQ world, and there's certainly LGBTQ tourism going on from North America and Europe to Cuba. So it's got one foot in that world and one foot in a very kind of conservative anti-LGBTQ rights world. And I'm not sure how that's going to pan out. But I have one interesting anecdote that I think I want to tell it here, because I think this group will actually appreciate it, because you know so much already about Latin America and possibly about Cuba. But I took a group of students on a study abroad trip down to Cuba. It was during the tail end of the Obama administration. And it was right before the U.S. interest section in Cuba was going to convert into an official U.S. embassy again after 55 years of not having an embassy in Cuba. And so we got to go into this interest section as a study abroad group from the U.S. and meet with a U.S. diplomat. And so my students, who are these gender studies students, are saying, well, actually, I guess the diplomat, she knew that was what we were there for. She knew the topic of what we were studying. And so she began to talk about some shortcomings of the Cuban state that were factually accurate, shortcomings about the Cuban state and women's rights. And so my students say, yeah, but Cuba pays for sex reassignment surgery. What do you think about that? So they're really kind of challenging this woman. And so she says, okay, yes, but Cuba only has done sex reassignment surgery, we found, with white Cubans. And so I thought it was just this super interesting moment of kind of an intersectional semi-sophistication and wokeness one-upmanship going on between an Obama administration future embassy and the Cuban government. So I don't know quite what to make of this. As it was happening, I was trying to think, like, is this a good sign? I think it is, like that there was that even the Obama administration felt compelled to kind of compete on those terms with the Cuban government. I think the Cuban government, well, certainly with the Trump administration, the US took huge steps backwards, but I think the Cuban government too is just not, it seems like it's in a stalled period right now. That attack on and imprisonment of Pride Parade protesters the year before last was one of the more disturbing forms of evidence of that, I think. So that was a lot of talking, but I think that's some of the, that's a lot of where the action seems to be, is revolving around sexuality and gender identity in Cuba, and surprising instances when the Cuban state is resisting what I would call moving ahead.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that anecdote as well. That's really fascinating. So we're almost out of time. Does anybody have a final question for Dr. Bayard de Volo? Yeah, Professor Lacerna?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really, really found it fascinating, and just your work is really incredible. I'm wondering what the reception of your work has been in Cuba and Nicaragua, because I feel like on the one, like as a reader who's not from these countries, like, I feel like you do a good job of kind of threading the needle between showing how emancipatory some of these movements were for women, but then also being really critical and not necessarily pulling any punches in terms of the sort of the gendered masculinities that exist within them. So as a reader, that's very satisfying. But as a Cuban, official, or as a Cuban historian, or I'm not sure what the reception would be, or in Nicaragua. I mean, one of the things is that you're writing about places where the revolutions triumphed, right? And so that kind of changes the sort of dynamic of research and also of access to sources in some ways that are more constraining probably than in other cases, but in other ways they open up kind of new avenues. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about, I guess, the reception, not just of your work, but also as you as a scholar doing these topics when you did.
Wow, this is such a great and important question, and I feel like I would love to talk to you for hours about it. So, yeah, with regards to my reception in Nicaragua, some of the most important moments in my academic career has been when I presented. And this, I can't guarantee that this would always be the case, but the instances that I've had where I've presented to a Nicaraguan audience or audience with Nicaraguans in it, and particularly sometimes with some Nicaraguan kind of prominent Sandinistas or ex-Sandinistas who thanked me, like and I don't ever expect to get thanked as an academic. You do your work and you try to do a good job, but there's the way they frame their thanks is just so incredibly been validating to me, because they're saying, yeah, this kind of this, it's particularly they're speaking to the emotional pain that these conflicts caused, the grief, this mourning that Sandinistas, like the combatants themselves, felt so profoundly, and Nicaragua understands itself as a nation of poets, and so they're in touch with their emotions a lot of times, not all of them, but like so many of them are just sentimental and really do kind of embrace the sadness of it, and so giving voice to particularly these mothers who are so effective. I don't give voice to it, but I listen to them and I wrote down what they said and then I talk about it, and kind of carrying on the message about that part about war. And that's something I touched on in my talk, but I didn't really stress it as much as I should have. Is I bring in a question like, is what I have an article out is like, is revolutionary war an oxymoron, or is it a contradiction in terms? Is like, because can you really have as this liberatory effort through an armed military group that depends completely upon hierarchy and hyper masculine ways of being? And I think one of the ways I make my case is through trauma and post-traumatic stress. And one of the ways that it manifests itself is kind of emotional distancing, like where people get estranged from their emotions. And I think, certainly that happened in Nicaragua too. And I think it absolutely happened in Cuba. But the Cuban record is just really hard to, I always search for signs of people talking about that. And there's certainly some suicides that happened that really clearly suggest this, but there's so little direct conversation about the trauma of that Cuban insurrection compared to the Nicaraguan one. And it's partly because I lived amongst I lived in a Sandinista household with an extended family of people who were just a little bit older than me, all of whom had played key roles in, not as leaders, but key roles in the insurrection or the Contra War, and just talk. They were very forthcoming and spoke with their heart on their sleeve about their really mixed emotions and their ambivalence. And there's just this incredible honesty there that Cuba just, if it ever achieved it, it didn't get into the records such that I can find it now. And certainly in today's Cuba, there's a real suspicion. Me, I'm a US citizen, I'm also white, and I'm a woman, and a lot of the interviews I was initially trying to was setting up was having to do with people who had served in Angola, because Cuba had a long military intervention there. And I kept really struggling. People would set up interviews for me. They're like, oh yeah, my neighbor, or this woman I know, or, and then so it would all get set up, and then I'd get called the night before or that day and say, oh no, the interview's off. Because people were nervous talking. I was told people were nervous talking to me. They don't know what they're allowed to say. And particularly to a US citizen. And so I haven't actually been back to Cuba since my book came out, so I don't know what they would say, or if it would even register. I've definitely talked to Cubans in other countries since my book came out, and including in the US, and talked to them about it. And so on a one-on-one level, they contribute important insights, and those particular people they're interested and haven't been upset by it, and actually are super interested kind of in some of the details, because some of my more empirical details come from their own sources. It's just stuff, these are stories that people have told a Cuban journalist, and then it gets published in a Cuban newspaper. And then I use quotes from that, and it's allowed me to kind of press back against the Cuban war story, but using the stories that I got from their own vetted sources, So, yeah, and I would love to talk to Cubans more about this, and I look forward to doing so. It's tough though, and you have to balance how much you want to work there in the future with kind of what kind of conversations you have, and also have a sensitivity, because I know a number of people who work in the universities, for example, and they can, I know they know a lot, and we kind of talk around the edges, but I just don't feel like pressing them for more, because they have their own careers that they need to think about. And so yeah, it's a difficult, convoluted question, but it gets into these very different revolutions in these post-revolution, or at least post-war contexts between Cuba and Nicaragua.
Yeah, so I think we're just out of time, but I just wanted to thank you all so much for attending, and thank you so much, Dr. Bayard de Volo, for sharing with us, your experiences and your knowledge. This was so fascinating. And just generally, thank you to everyone who has supported the GSLAC group. This is our last event for the year, maybe ever. We're not sure.
Oh, no.
So thank you so much to everybody. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great Easter and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I would just want to say, I see some things in the chat, and if anybody wants to stick around and ask me anything, I'm happy to. I don't have to run immediately. If you have to run and you want to contact me about your research interests or mine, you're really welcome to do so. It's just so nice to be with you. You have a special thing going there, that you can collect so many Latin Americanists who have these these common intellectual backgrounds and understandings, so that we can we don't have to start at the starting point, and we can actually get into some detail. So I appreciate that from you all.